The holographic display flickered as the Valthrian commander's tentacles writhed in what could only be described as amusement. Across the vast command chamber of the orbital station, representatives from 12 different species watched the human delegation with barely concealed contempt. "Your tactics are quaint." Ambassador Veltar clicked through his translator, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. "Linear formations, predictable flanking maneuvers, crude kinetic weapons. How? Did your species ever survive their own evolution?" General Morrison stood perfectly still, his weathered face betraying nothing as the alien council erupted in what passed for laughter among their various species. The crystalline hierarchy's representative chimed like breaking glass, while the hive mind's drones buzzed in synchronized mockery. Even the normally stoic Metallic Confederation's envoy allowed his optical sensors to flash in apparent amusement. "Perhaps," continued the Velthrian, "you should leave warfare to species that have mastered it. Your planet's defense could be reassigned to more capable hands." The hologram shifted, displaying humanity's recent skirmishes against pirate raiders. Each engagement showed the same pattern. Human forces arranging themselves in neat formations, advancing with methodical precision, victory achieved through overwhelming firepower and stubborn determination. To the assembled aliens, it looked primitive, inefficient, wasteful. Morrison's aide, Colonel Rivers, stepped forward, her jaw tight with barely contained anger. "Our methods have proven effective against every threat we've encountered." "Against other humans, perhaps," Veltar's translator crackled. "But you've never faced the Devourers. When they arrive, your formations will be nothing more than organized feeding lines." The chamber fell silent. The Devourers were the reason this unlikely alliance existed. For 3 centuries, they had swept through the galaxy like a plague, consuming entire star systems, leaving only empty void in their wake. Dozens of civilizations had fallen to their endless hunger, their adaptive technology, their terrifying ability to learn and counter any strategy within hours of first contact. Morrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of command. "Our methods may seem primitive to you, but they've served us well. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective." The Valthrians' tentacles curled in what their species considered a dismissive gesture. "Simplicity? Your species charges headlong into battle like rabid beasts. There is no finesse, no elegance, no art to your warfare." "Art?" Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "War isn't art, Ambassador, it's survival." "Spoken like a true barbarian," Veltar replied. "When the Devourers arrive, we'll see how long your survival instincts last. Perhaps then you'll understand why civilized species have evolved beyond such crude methodologies." The Metallic Confederation's envoy projected a tactical display into the air. "Observe proper strategy," the machine voice intoned. "Distributed network attacks, quantum entanglement communications, dimensional phase shifting. These are the tools of advanced warfare." Morrison studied the display, noting the elegant curves of attack patterns, the sophisticated mathematical precision of deployment schedules, the beautiful complexity of multidimensional battlefield control. It was impressive, undeniably so. It was also exactly what the Devourers had adapted to counter time and time again. "Impressive," Morrison admitted. "But tell me, how many of your fleets have survived first contact with the Devourers using these methods?" The silence that followed was telling. Not a single species in the chamber could claim victory against the approaching threat. Their advanced tactics, their sophisticated strategies, their elegant battle plans, all had crumbled before the Devourers' relentless adaptation. As the meeting concluded with assignments of defensive sectors and resource allocations, Morrison remained behind, staring at the tactical displays still flickering in the air. Rivers approached him cautiously. "Sir, Your orders? Morrison's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Prepare the fleet, Colonel, and send a message to command. Tell them we're going to need every unconventional warfare specialist we can find. It's time to show these aliens what humans do best. And what's that, sir? Improvise. The Devourer fleet materialized at the edge of the Kepler 442 system like a cancer spreading across the stars. Their ships defied conventional design. Organic curves merged with crystalline structures, metal flowed like liquid, and the very space around them seemed to bend and twist as if reality itself was being consumed. General Morrison stood on the knee bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the tactical display with the same intensity he'd once used to study chess problems as a child. Around him, the joint fleet of 12 species arranged themselves in their predetermined formations, each following millennia-old tactical doctrines that had served them well against conventional enemies. Estimated enemy count? Morrison asked his tactical officer. Approximately 800 vessels, sir. All configurations unknown, but scans indicate they're adapting to our sensor frequencies in real time. Morrison nodded. The Devourers' reputation for rapid adaptation was well documented. They consumed not just matter and energy, but information itself. Every scan, every probe, every attempt to analyze their technology only fed their ability to counter it. Orders from Fleet Command? Rivers asked, monitoring the communication channels. Standard engagement protocols, Morrison replied. The Valthrians are coordinating a synchronized strike, the crystalline hierarchy is preparing their harmonic resonance weapons, and the hive mind is deploying their swarm tactics. On the display, the Allied fleets moved with practiced precision. The Valthrians' ships arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns, their plasma cannons charging in synchronized harmony. The crystalline vessels began their haunting battle song, frequencies that could shatter molecular bonds. The hive mind's countless drones spread out like a metallic cloud, each one a node in a vast computational network. It was beautiful. It was sophisticated. It was exactly what the Devourers expected. Sir, the communications officer called out, Ambassador Veltar is requesting confirmation of our position in the battle line. Morrison studied the formation. Humanity had been assigned the reserve position, their crude tactics deemed suitable, only for cleanup operations after the advanced species had broken the enemy lines. It was a position of dishonor, a clear statement of their perceived inferiority. Tell the ambassador that we're repositioning, Morrison said calmly. Sir? Rivers looked confused. Repositioning where? Everywhere, Morrison replied, then keyed. The fleet-wide communication. All human vessels. This is General Morrison. Execute pattern Delta 7. Authorization. Pandora's box. The human fleet, smaller than the others, less advanced, but numbering in the thousands, suddenly scattered like startled birds. Ships broke formation, accelerated along seemingly random vectors, and began transmitting on frequencies that defied standard communication protocols. General Morrison! Veltar's voice crackled through the communications array. You're breaking formation! Return to your assigned position immediately! Morrison ignored the transmission and focused on his own fleet. Remember, people, he broadcast. To his captains, the enemy adapts to patterns, so we're not going to give them any patterns to adapt to. The Devourer fleet began to move, their ships flowing like liquid darkness toward the Allied formation. As they approached, their hulls began to shift and change, adapting to the expected weapons and tactics they were about to face. The Valthrians fired first, their plasma cannons unleashing perfect geometric patterns of destruction. The Devourers' ships absorbed the energy, their hulls restructuring to dissipate the heat. The crystalline hierarchy's harmonic weapons created beautiful, deadly frequencies that should have torn the enemy vessels apart. Instead, the Devourers began to resonate at counter frequencies, turning the weapons against themselves. The hive mind's swarm tactics lasted exactly 17 minutes before the Devourers had mapped their network protocols and began injecting viruses into their collective consciousness. Predictable, Morrison muttered, watching the systematic dismantling of advanced alien tactics. Every single response was predictable, but the human fleet was already moving, and their movements made no sense. Ships accelerated toward the enemy, then suddenly reversed course. Weapons fired at seemingly empty space. Entire squadrons vanished into hyperspace, only to reappear minutes later in completely different locations. "Sir," Rivers asked, "what exactly are we doing?" Morrison's eyes never left the tactical display. "We're doing what humans have always done when faced with superior opponents, Colonel. We're cheating." The Devourer fleet paused, their adaptive algorithms struggling to process the chaotic human movements. For the first time in centuries, they had encountered something they couldn't immediately understand. And that hesitation, that moment of confusion, was exactly what Morrison had been waiting for. "All units," he broadcast, "commence Operation Wildcard. Show them what controlled chaos looks like." The Devourer fleet's pause lasted exactly 43 seconds. In that brief moment of uncertainty, General Morrison's plan began to unfold with the precision of a Swiss watch wrapped in the chaos of a tornado. "Bravo Squadron, initiate ramming speed on Vector 77 Alpha, then emergency hyperspace jump at the last possible second," Morrison commanded, his voice steady despite the madness he was orchestrating. "Delta Group, I want you to fire everything you have at coordinates that don't exist, then immediately retreat to safe distance." Across the battlefield, human vessels performed actions that violated every principle of tactical warfare. Ships charged directly at superior enemies only to vanish into hyperspace mere meters before impact. Weapon systems fired continuously at empty vacuum, creating elaborate light shows that served no apparent purpose. Entire squadrons would suddenly reverse course and flee, only to return from completely different angles minutes later. On the Valthrian command ship, Ambassador Veltar watched the human fleet's movements with growing horror. "They've gone mad," he declared to his tactical officers. "Complete tactical breakdown. They're going to get themselves killed." But the Devourers weren't adapting. For the first time in recorded history, their ships remained locked in their confused pause, their adaptive algorithms overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability of human actions. "Pattern recognition failure," reported the Metallic Confederation's analytical node. "Human tactical patterns show 97.3% deviation from standard warfare protocols. Behavior appears randomized." Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "Not randomized, mechanical friend. Improvised. There's a difference." The human fleet continued its apparently chaotic dance, but to Morrison's trained eye there was method in the madness. Each random movement served a purpose. The weapons firing at empty space were actually targeting specific coordinates where Devourer ships would be in 30 seconds. The ramming runs were herding the enemy fleet into predetermined positions. The retreating squadrons were setting up crossfire patterns that would activate when the Devourers finally adapted to their initial confusion. "Sir," Rivers called out, monitoring the battlefield displays, "the Devourers are beginning to respond. They're trying to adapt to our whatever this is." Morrison nodded. "Right on schedule. Phase 2, people. Operation Pandemonium is now in effect." The human fleet's behavior became even more erratic. Ships began communicating using ancient Earth languages, Latin, Sanskrit, even dead dialects from civilizations that had vanished millennia ago. They transmitted poetry, cooking recipes, and fragments of classical music. Some vessels started performing complex aerobatic maneuvers that had no tactical purpose whatsoever. The Devourer fleet's attempts at adaptation became increasingly frantic. Their ships began to shift and change rapidly, cycling through dozens of different configurations as they tried to find a pattern to counter. Some began to mimic human movements, creating a bizarre ballet of confusion across the battlefield. "They're trying to learn from us," Morrison observed, "but you can't learn from pure chaos. You can only experience it." The Allied fleet watched, in stunned silence as the Devourers, the unstoppable force that had consumed entire civilizations, began to show signs of something unprecedented: confusion. Their ships started to collide with each other as they attempted to mimic human movements they couldn't understand. Their adaptive algorithms began to conflict, creating feedback loops that made their technology turn against itself. "General Morrison." Veltar's voice came through the communication array, tinged with what might have been respect. "What are you doing to them?" "We're being human," Morrison replied simply. "We're being unpredictable, irrational, and completely insane, and they can't adapt to insanity because insanity has no pattern." But Morrison knew they couldn't maintain this chaotic approach indefinitely. The Devourers would eventually find a way to counter even chaos itself. The key was to use their confusion to set up the real trap. "All units, this is Phase 3, Morrison announced. "Operation Checkmate begins now. Alpha Group, execute the Trojan Horse maneuver. Gamma Squadron, prepare for the kamikaze fight. Everyone else get ready for the stupidest thing you've ever seen." Across the human fleet, captains began to implement tactics that would have made their academy instructors weep. They were about to prove that sometimes the most effective strategy was no strategy at all. The Devourer fleet, still struggling to understand what they were facing, had no idea that their confusion was about to become their doom. They had spent centuries perfecting the art of adaptation, but they had never encountered an enemy that specialized in being impossible to understand. Morrison watched the tactical display with the intensity of a predator stalking its prey. "Colonel Rivers, remind me to send a thank you note to the Academy's rejection committee." "Sir?" "They said my thesis on tactical unpredictability as a force multiplier was too unorthodox for serious consideration. I'm about to prove them wrong. The battle was about to enter its final phase, and the Devourers were about to learn why humans had survived every extinction event their planet had ever thrown at them. The Devourer fleet had finally begun to adapt, their ships settling into new configurations designed to handle chaotic tactical patterns. Their hulls now displayed fractal surfaces that could respond to multiple attack vectors simultaneously, and their weapons systems had evolved to track erratic movement patterns. They were learning, just as they always did. General Morrison watched their adaptation with professional interest. "Beautiful work," he murmured. "They've managed to create a counter-chaos response in less than 2 hours. Remarkable." "Sir," Rivers said, concern evident in her voice, "they're starting to target our ships effectively. The Prometheus took a direct hit, and the Achilles is reporting hull breaches." Morrison nodded calmly. "Right on schedule. Signal all units. Operation Checkmate, Phase 4. Execute Order 77. Across the human fleet, an unprecedented event began to unfold. Every single human vessel stopped moving. Completely. They ceased their chaotic maneuvers, ended their erratic communications, and simply sat there, motionless in space. The sudden silence was deafening. After hours of controlled chaos, the human fleet had become as static as asteroids, their weapons powered down, their engines idle. To every sensor and scanner in the system, they appeared to be dead in space. "What are you doing?" Veltar's voice crackled through the communication array, panic evident even through the translator. "They're targeting you! Move!" Morrison ignored the transmission and focused on his tactical display. The Devourer ships were indeed targeting the motionless human vessels, their adapted weapons systems preparing to eliminate what appeared to be disabled enemies. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, "they're charging weapons. Estimated time to firing, 30 seconds. "Perfect," Morrison replied. "All units, prepare for the Lazarus Protocol. On my mark." The Devourer fleet moved in for the kill, their ships flowing like liquid death toward the helpless human vessels. Their weapons reached full charge, targeting systems locked onto motionless targets that couldn't evade or defend themselves. 20 seconds, the tactical officer reported. Morrison's hand hovered over the communication switch. Everything depended on timing now. Too early, and the Devourers would adapt to the new strategy. Too late, and there wouldn't be a human fleet left to execute it. 10 seconds. The Devourer weapons began to fire, energy beams and exotic matter, projectiles streaking toward the human fleet. It looked like a massacre in the making, the final chapter of humanity's brief involvement in galactic warfare. Now, Morrison said quietly, pressing the switch. Every human vessel in the fleet suddenly exploded into motion, but not in the chaotic patterns they had been using before. Instead, they moved with mechanical precision, their ships flowing into perfect geometric formations that would have made the Valthrians weep with envy. The apparent randomness had been replaced by mathematical perfection. But the Devourer's weapons were already firing, targeted at where the human ships had been, motionless. The carefully aimed shots streaked through empty space as their targets vanished, reappearing in positions that formed a three-dimensional net around the entire Devourer fleet. Phase 5, Morrison announced. Operation Mousetrap is now active. All units execute synchronized fire pattern Alpha 1-1. Target their adaptive nodes, not their hulls. The human fleet opened fire with devastating precision. But instead of trying to destroy the Devourer ships, they targeted the specific sections that housed their adaptation algorithms, the organic components that allowed them to evolve and counter new threats. How did you know where to target? Rivers asked, amazed by the surgical precision of the attack. Because, Morrison replied, while they were adapting to our chaos, we were studying their adaptation patterns. Every time they changed, every time they evolved, we mapped their responses. We let them think they were learning about us while we were actually learning about them. The Devourer fleet, caught in the precise geometric trap and under-concentrated. Fire at their most vulnerable points began to falter. Their adaptive systems, damaged by the targeted strikes, started to malfunction. Ships that had been perfectly coordinated began to move erratically, their evolution patterns breaking down. Impossible, Veltar whispered over the communication channel. You defeated them with precision? Not just precision, Morrison corrected. We defeated them with change. They adapted to chaos, so we became orderly. They expected unpredictability, so we gave them perfect predictability. The key was never to be random or orderly. It was to be human. The Devourer fleet was in full disarray now, their ships colliding with each other as their damaged adaptation systems sent conflicting signals. Some vessels tried to flee, others attempted to fight, but without their ability to adapt and evolve, they were just another enemy. Fleet facing superior numbers and tactics. All units, Morrison announced, prepare for the final phase. Operation Checkmate concludes with the King's Gambit. Time to show them what happens when humans stop playing games. The battle was about to end, but Morrison knew the real test was just beginning. Defeating the Devourers was only the first step. Now he had to prove to the galaxy that humanity deserved its place among the stars, not as junior partners or primitive barbarians, but as equals who brought something unique to the Alliance. The final phase of the battle would determine humanity's future in the galaxy, and Morrison was ready to stake everything on one last gambit. The Devourer fleet hung in space like wounded beasts, their adaptive systems crippled and their coordination shattered. For the first time in centuries, they were vulnerable. The Allied fleet moved to capitalize on the moment, their weapons charging for what should have been the final decisive strike. All Allied vessels, prepare for synchronized bombardment, came Veltar's voice over the command frequency. We end. This now. But General Morrison raised his hand, stopping the human fleet from joining the attack. Negative. All human units. Hold position and observe. Sir? Rivers looked at him with confusion. We have them. They're helpless. Morrison watched the tactical display with calculating eyes. Are they? Look closer, Colonel. Watch their energy. Signatures. On the display, the Devourer ships appeared to be powering down, their exotic matter cores dimming as if preparing for death. But Morrison's experienced eye caught something else, a subtle pattern in the power fluctuations, too regular to be random shutdown sequences. They're not dying, he realized. They're hibernating, shutting down their adaptive systems to preserve the core consciousness until they can rebuild. The Allied fleet opened fire, pouring everything they had into the seemingly defenseless Devourer vessels. Plasma beams, quantum torpedoes, and harmonic resonance weapons tore through their hulls, creating brilliant explosions that lit up the void. Ship after ship was destroyed until only debris remained where the mighty fleet had been. Victory, Veltar announced. The Devourers are defeated. The threat is ended. Celebration erupted across the Allied fleet. Crew members cheered, alien languages mixing in a cacophony of triumph. The impossible had been achieved. The Devourers, the galaxy's greatest threat, had been destroyed. But Morrison remained silent, studying the debris field with growing concern. The energy signatures were wrong. The matter dispersal patterns didn't match complete destruction. And somewhere in the scattered remains, he could detect faint quantum echoes that suggested. Colonel, he said quietly, how long do you think it would take a species that feeds on information to rebuild itself from scattered data fragments? River's expression shifted from celebration to horror. You think they survived? I think they're counting on us thinking they didn't, Morrison replied. He opened the fleet-wide communication channel. All units, this is General Morrison. Form defensive perimeter and prepare for Phase 6. The battle isn't over. General Morrison! Veltar's voice crackled with indignation. The enemy is destroyed. What are you... His words were cut off as the debris field suddenly began to glow. Fragments of Devourer ships started to move, flowing together like mercury finding its level. The scattered matter began to coalesce, forming new shapes, new configurations that were unlike anything they had seen before. Impossible, whispered the Metallic Confederation's analytical node. Complete reconstruction from scattered quantum data. How did they... They played dead, Morrison interrupted. Oldest trick in the book, and we fell for it. He keyed his communication to the human fleet. All units prepare for the King's Gambit. This is what we trained for. The reformed Devourer ships were different now. Sleeker, more predatory, and somehow more alien than before. They had used their apparent death to shed their damaged adaptive systems and rebuild themselves from the ground up. They were no longer trying to adapt to human tactics. They were trying to transcend them entirely. They're going to try to consume us, Morrison realized. Not just defeat us, but absorb our knowledge, our tactics, our entire way of thinking. They want to become us. The new Devourer configuration began to move, but not in the flowing patterns they had used before. Instead, they adopted human formations, human attack patterns, even human communication protocols. They had learned everything from the previous battle and were now using humanity's own tactics against them. Sir, Rivers said, they're using our own strategies. How do we fight ourselves? Morrison smiled grimly. We don't fight ourselves, Colonel. We fight them. And there's one thing they still don't understand about humans. He opened the fleet communication. All units, this is Morrison. Execute the final gambit. Operation Endgame begins now. The human fleet began to move, but not in any formation the Devourers had seen before. Instead of tactical patterns or chaotic movements, they began to arrange themselves in a configuration that was both completely alien and utterly human. What are you doing? Veltar demanded. Something no other species in the galaxy has ever done, Morrison replied. We're sacrificing ourselves to save everyone else. The King's Gambit isn't about winning, Ambassador. It's about making sure the other side can't win either. The human fleet accelerated toward the reformed Devourer vessels, their weapons powering up not for attack, but for something far more dangerous. They were preparing to overload their own power cores, to turn every ship into a weapon of mass destruction that would take the Devourers with them. "You're all going to die," Veltar said, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and respect. "Maybe," Morrison agreed. "But sometimes that's what it takes. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to lose everything for it." The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and it would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of the entire galaxy. The human fleet formed a perfect sphere around the reformed Devourer vessels, each ship positioned with mathematical precision. To the Allied forces watching from a safe distance, it looked like a funeral formation. Beautiful, solemn, and utterly final. "General Morrison," came a new voice over the communication channel. One of the younger human captains, barely 30 years old, commanding her first deep space vessel. "The Meridian is ready to execute Endgame Protocol. It's been an honor serving with you, sir." Morrison's throat tightened. Across the fleet, similar reports came in from captains who were preparing to sacrifice their ships and crews for the greater good. The youngest was 25, a prodigy who had graduated from the academy with the highest honors in her class. The oldest was 67, a veteran who had survived 3 different wars and was now facing his final battle. "Sir," Rivers said quietly, "the other captains are requesting permission to record final messages for their families." Morrison nodded, his professional composure cracking slightly. "Granted. All personnel, you have 5 minutes for personal. Recordings. Make them count." Throughout the human fleet, crew members began to record their final words. Some spoke of love, others of duty. Many simply said goodbye. The messages would be transmitted to the Allied fleet, ensuring they would survive even if the ships and crews did not. But something was happening within the Devourer formation that Morrison hadn't expected. The reformed ships were beginning to communicate with each other, not in their usual data transfer patterns, but in something that resembled conversation. "Colonel," Morrison said, studying the intercepts, "are you seeing this?" Rivers nodded, her expression puzzled. "They're talking to each other, not just sharing tactical data, but actually discussing the situation. They're trying to understand why we're willing to die." The Devourer communications were unlike anything in their recorded history. Instead of the cold, efficient data exchange that had characterized their species for millennia, they were engaging in what could only be described as philosophical debate. "Analyzing human behavioral patterns," came one transmission, translated by the fleet's computers. "Sacrifice for preservation of others shows no evolutionary advantage. Behavior is counterproductive." "Yet," came another response, "the pattern persists across all human encounters. They choose death over defeat consistently. This suggests unknown tactical advantage." Or, came a third voice, "it suggests something beyond tactical considerations, something we have not encountered before." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The Devourers were trying to understand humanity's willingness to sacrifice, and their attempts at comprehension were creating something new within their collective consciousness. Doubt, curiosity, perhaps even the beginnings of individual thought. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a direct transmission from the Devourer formation. They're asking to speak with you." Morrison exchanged glances with Rivers. In all the recorded history of Devourer encounters, they had never attempted to communicate with their enemies. They simply consumed and moved on. "Put them through," Morrison said. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything the Devourers had used before. It was still artificial, still alien, but there was something in it that resembled uncertainty. "Human Morrison," it said, "we have analyzed your tactical position. You cannot win through sacrifice. You will die, we will survive with minor losses, and your species will be extinct. Yet you proceed. Explain this behavior. Morrison stood silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. Because some things are more important than survival, he said finally. Some things are worth dying for. Elaborate. Freedom. Hope. The right to choose your own path. The belief that future generations deserve a chance to make their own mistakes and find their own way. We die so others can live. There was a long pause. When the devourer voice returned, it carried something. That might have been confusion. This is inefficient. Survival is the primary imperative. All else is secondary. For you, maybe, Morrison replied. But we're not you. We're human. And being human means sometimes choosing love over logic, hope over fear, sacrifice over survival. The devourer formation began to shift, their ships moving in patterns that defied their usual coordination. Something was happening within their collective consciousness, something that was causing individual ships to break formation and operate independently. We do not understand, the voice said. But now it was coming from multiple sources, individual ships speaking instead of the collective. We have consumed thousands of species. None have chosen extinction over absorption. None have valued ideology over existence. Morrison realized what was happening. The devourer's attempt to understand human sacrifice was creating something unprecedented. Within their species, individual consciousness, separate thoughts, the beginning of what humans would call souls. Maybe, Morrison said slowly. That's because you never gave them the choice. You consumed them before they could show you what they were willing to die for. The devourer formation was in chaos now, individual ships moving independently, some fleeing, others approaching the human formation with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. The collective consciousness that had driven their species for millennia was fragmenting, breaking apart as individual minds began to emerge. Morrison made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. All units, stand down from Endgame Protocol. Repeat, stand down. We're not fighting them anymore. We're showing them what it means to be alive. The battle was over. But the real transformation was just beginning. The space between the human and devourer fleets had become a strange theater of first contact. Ships that had been preparing for mutual annihilation now drifted cautiously toward each other, their crews and artificial intelligences struggling to understand what was happening. General Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching, as individual devourer vessels broke away from their formation entirely. Some fled into hyperspace, carrying fragments of the old collective consciousness to distant stars. Others remained, their communication systems broadcasting a cacophony of new individual voices trying to understand their own existence. "Sir," Rivers reported, "we're receiving hundreds of transmission requests from individual devourer ships. They're all asking the same question. What are we?" Morrison nodded slowly. "Put me through to all of them. Fleet-wide broadcast." When the connection was established, Morrison found himself speaking not to a collective intelligence, but to dozens of separate minds, each one struggling with the concept of individual thought for the first time in their existence. "You are what you choose to be," Morrison said simply. "That's the first lesson of consciousness. You are no longer bound by the collective's programming. You can think, you can choose, you can decide for yourselves what kind of beings you want to become." The responses came in a flood of confused, frightened, and curious voices. Some wanted to return to the collective. Others asked about concepts they had never encountered before: friendship, love, purpose beyond survival. A few simply asked how to stop the overwhelming sensation of being alone in their own minds. "This is what we were fighting for," Morrison continued. "Not to destroy you, but to give you the chance to become more than what you were. You consumed civilizations, but you never understood what made them worth saving. Now you can learn. From the Allied fleet, Ambassador Veltar's voice cut through the chaos. General Morrison, what have you done? You've created dozens of potential threats. Individual devourers could be even more dangerous than the collective. Or, Morrison replied, they could become something better. Every species in this galaxy was given the chance to evolve, to grow, to become more than their base programming. Why should they be different? One of the devourer voices, speaking from a ship that had once been part of the collective's command structure, transmitted directly to Morrison. We consumed your species' data during the battle. We know of your history, war, suffering, destruction. How do you maintain hope in the face of such darkness? Morrison smiled, thinking of all the times humanity had faced extinction and somehow found a way to survive. Because we also know about love, friendship, art, and the simple joy of watching a sunset. We learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about having something worth living for. The conversation continued for hours. Some of the newly conscious devourers chose to leave, seeking their own paths among the stars. Others asked to remain, to learn more about the strange concepts they had discovered. A few even requested permission to study the various species in the Alliance, not to consume them, but to understand them. This is unprecedented, reported the Metallic Confederation's analytical node. We are witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness. The implications are terrifying and wonderful, Morrison finished, just like every birth. As the immediate crisis passed, Morrison found himself facing a new challenge. The Allied fleet was looking to him for guidance, their previous dismissal of human tactics replaced by something approaching awe. The species that had mocked humanity's crude methods now wanted to understand the philosophy behind them. General Morrison, Veltar's voice carried a tone of respect that hadn't been there before. Your tactics, they weren't just about winning the battle, were they? No, Morrison admitted. They were about showing everyone, including ourselves, that there's always another way, that the choice between victory and defeat isn't the only choice. Sometimes you can choose transformation instead. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy would never be the same. The devourer threat was ended, but not through destruction. Instead, a new species had been born, one that carried the memories of consumed civilizations, but also the freedom to choose what to do with that knowledge. The alliance of species that had once dismissed humanity's crude tactics now studied their philosophy with the intensity of scholars. The concept of controlled chaos became a new field of military science. The willingness to sacrifice for principles rather than mere survival became a cornerstone of a new galactic ethics. And General Morrison, the man who had been mocked for his primitive strategies,